But I am very happy to be here because my whole reason for going into academia was to find a way to support collaboration for all of you who are doing the hard work with people on the spectrum to help them have successful outcomes. So I'm very pleased to be here speaking with you all today. Now, the presentation before mine was very different than the presentation you're about to hear. The presentation before mine was a lot about state and regional services and the coordination and all of the legal and complicated work that is happening in the state of California. Sort of the top-down arrangement of services and efforts that are being made now. My presentation is really more like the bottom-up. Like, do any of those things show up in the young adults network? Are those services connected to these young adults who are transitioning? And can we measure that and then hopefully change the personal networks of these young adults? You know, what can we do to help support that? And so I'm going to ask you today to kind of imagine, you know, to learn about the work that we're trying to do to imagine how that could happen. To begin, I have taken the liberty of slightly revising a familiar and well-loved saying to introduce the focus of this talk. It takes a networked village to transition a child to adulthood. So what is a networked village? And can we measure it? And how can a networked village help young people transition successfully? So I'd like to say a networked village is a team of people that play an important role in the young adult's transition. For example, these people might provide the young adult with information about job possibilities, contacts for internships, financial support, information about employment training programs, job coaching, career exploration, friendship and companionship for the life challenges that occur during transition. And these resources, they can help change outcomes for young adults. But in addition to providing resources, these supporters can also be connected to one another. This is the core idea of the networked village. The supporters of the young adults share ideas and team up to provide coordinated supports for the young adults during transition. This is what I mean by a networked village. It turns out there's a name for the resources that are embedded in our social networks. It's called social capital. Social capital is people plus connections plus resources. The idea is that our social networks provide us with social capital that can help us to overcome challenges and achieve difficult goals, like finding our way into adulthood. What are some examples of how social capital might flow through a networked village for ASD transitions in youth? So for perhaps a young adult's parents has a relationship with an agency that does supported employment. As a result, he learns about supported employment opportunities. You know, in the session that we were just in, I watched parents learn about some of these things. So, you know, the parents who are here in this audience are building their capital so that they can bring it back to their young adult and change their outcomes. So young adults also receive social and emotional supports for transition from their peers, from their family, from their service providers, and as a result, they can learn how to cope with difficult emotions during this challenging time of transition, and those things that could impede the success of their transition. Or the young adult might have friends that have relationships with the high school workability coordinator, and then she learns how to access the resources through the coordinator through her friend network or her peer network or her acquaintance network. Or the young adult's parents and the IEP case manager can coordinate to help him and to meet his employment goals. And these are all ways in which the team around the young adult can become connected and the way that resources like social capital can flow to the young adult. In these examples, the supporters are connected to these key resources, and through their relationships, they can act as a conduit for the young adult. For this presentation, I propose a way to measure social capital in a systematic way. As the saying goes, if you can measure something, it is easier to change it. And the bigger, more ambitious your goal, the bigger and ambitious goal that I have is to help young adults with ASD build social networks that are infused with the social capital that they need to have a more successful transition. But first, we have to kind of take a step back and figure out, like, how do we measure this? And then we can figure out, like, what are the winning configurations? Like, how do we make these social capital ecosystems that are so unique to each individual person? So these are big questions, and where I'm at with this work is really trying to tackle the measurement piece. Like, how do we show where the capital is, who the people are, just starting at that beginning point of starting to build and measure the ecosystem. All right. So this is our agenda. We're gonna map a social capital ecosystem, and I'm gonna provide an example. And I gave you guys a handout. If you want to go through a thought exercise also with me, you can think of your own young adult and map those resources on the handout. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that are there that make it difficult to build social capital for young adults with ASD. And then I'm going to share 2 social capital ecosystem maps that we completed at Drexel with transition age use with ASD. So this is our first pilot test of trying to ask these young adults who's in your network and what resources do they have and how connected are they, and I get to show you what those maps look like. And finally, I'm going to introduce 4 types of social network interventions to get us thinking about some possibilities. All right, so let's talk about the idea of a social capital ecosystem. So we know what an ecosystem is. It's sort of the living and non-living interrelationships that sustain life. So we have today the opportunity to think about an ecosystem centered around the young adult with interrelated people, neighborhoods, resources, and organizations. Bronfenbrenner was an American psychologist, and he gave us a way to envision our social worlds as multidimensional. He took many complicated ideas and he organized them all together in this map of circles. And I know that the text is small and the picture is blurry, but hopefully you guys have a picture of this in your binders. I noticed some people had binder representations, but we can walk through it a little bit. So what we have is a microsystem. So we have the child. Oh good, I'm attached here. The young adult here, and then the microsystem around them is the people who directly work with that young adult, who are either every day or at school or at their place of internship, or their friends in the community or their community participation, if they participate in a community event, those people there, those are the people in the microsystem. And then after the microsystem, we have the mesosystem, which is the context that surrounds the young adult during the everyday activities, including places like home, or the mall, or the neighborhood, or the classroom, or the sports team, or the church, or the friendship groups. And those things are all in turn influenced by what Dr. Bronfenbrenner calls the exosystem, which includes the people and resources and organizations that are connected to the people who are connected to the young person. And then the final macro system is the larger societal dynamics, such as cultures, values, and laws. And then I guess there's one more concept which is very relevant to us today, which is, this is a system around a child that's changing and growing and developing. So we're really focusing hard here. They call it the chronos system just to reference time and change over time. But we're really looking at the time when the young adult is emerging into adulthood. So that's the particular time point that we're going to be thinking about. So now that we have a framework for organizing our ideas, let's map a social capital ecosystem for a person that you know with ASD. So I'll fill mine out up here on the PowerPoint, and if you would like, you can take this opportunity to kind of think of a person with autism who is a young adult transitioning to adulthood, and you can kind of imagine some of these questions that I'm going to be asking myself here. All right, so first, my example that I'm sharing with you here is going to be about Joey. So here we see the people, and there are probably many people in the microsystem, but we're going to pick key people for the sake of time and space. So here we have the people around Joey who are in Joey's microsystem. And that includes his parent, his grandma, his school counselor, his job coach, his teacher, and a VR representative. Next, you can think about the supports that these people provide directly to the person that you're imagining. And in my case, it's Joey. So we can see here that Joey's parent provides transition support and emotional support. Joey's grandma provides advice and emotional support. The counselor provides job info and mental health counseling. Joey's job coach provides employment skills, transition supports. Joey's teacher provides education supports, transition supports, and Joey's VR counselor provides transition supports and job info. Now, we know these people provide more than this for Joey, but we're just, for the sake of illustration, trying to think of these key resources. And in particular, we might want to think about which of these resources might really help with Joey's transition, you know, in finding employment or in figuring out what they're going to do, what he's going to do after he graduates. So you can look at the resources that are around the young adult that the microsystem is providing. And now when we're looking at home connections and we see that the parent and the grandma are connected, we can start to envision what about home could we change or add? Are there people at home who can help us to help Joey to transition more effectively? So in this example, we have an older sibling who is just completing higher ed. And so the idea here would be that someone who has, if Joey is thinking about transitioning to a higher ed setting, having a sibling who just recently experienced that and having that person more directly connected to the young adult, to Joey, right, in this example, that could be a very valuable resource. So at home, there are resources among siblings and aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas that we don't necessarily always think about. So trying to strategically look and see what's there at home and what could be accessed to enhance the network is one way to think about changing the network. So next we have our VR person, and in this example, the parent is connected to the VR person. And then we have the parent who's also connected to the teacher, and we have the resources of the teacher. So what we learn now is that the parent in this young adult's network, this networked community, the parent is coordinating at home, coordinating in the community, and coordinating at school. And this is a lot of coordinating. And I don't have to tell all of you who are sitting in these chairs that you are doing a lot of work. One of my main efforts is to try and show people what parents are actually doing and to explain the real effort and time and resources that go into building these networks. So what we can see from this example is that the parent is acting as a broker across home, across community, across school. And we see here too that the teacher and the VR are not connected, which is maybe a missed opportunity. All right, so there's no connection there, and that is a missed opportunity. So another thing about carefully mapping these networks is they can reveal gaps and missed opportunities, not just to the parent who probably knows that the VR and the teacher are not talking, but to the VR and to the teacher, for them to be able to see, hey, with this child, this is a missed opportunity. So that's another way to think about it. And here in this network, the teacher is connected to the job coach. So this is a very fortuitous connection because the teacher might know a lot about what works for the young adult, and they might have strategies that they have built and designed that work for the young adult in the classroom, and they might actually be very useful for the work environment. So we could see that this is a fortuitous connection. Now there's no connection between the job coach and the parent. This, you know, might be a lost opportunity because perhaps the parent has strategies and ideas about what would work for the young adult in their work environment that the job coach is not taking advantage of. Or it might be a nice relief for the parent to not have to be talking to everyone. So these networks it's not always clear what the perfect network is. I think truly, I started this work about 5 years ago thinking that I would just be coming up with the right map, that you could just take every young adult's map and measure it and say, oh, this is a little bit wrong here and a little bit wrong there, but everyone is different. This is all going to be very individualized for every young adult. All right, so then we see that in this example, the licensed counselor is not connected to the network and to anyone in the network. So, that is a lost opportunity. And, the reason for this lack of connection is because the licensed counselor is not allowed to bill out for coordination or collaboration hours. So there's like legal restrictions in their workplace about what they can bill for. And they cannot bill for collaboration coordination. It's just not part of their job mandate. And so we find that these are systems level problems. In the presentation before this, we learned a lot about systems change and systems interventions and some disconnects that parents were experiencing. And I think, what you see when you start looking at like how are these things actually reaching the young adult, and are they, is that you start to see the breakdown of when the connection didn't happen or when the opportunity wasn't able to be coordinated across the networked team. So these are ways to think about using network analysis to reveal gaps, to show what's there, and to understand how much work is going into what's happening. Oh, here's the very important question. One very important question is, how can Joey's team begin to strategically to allow Joey to become the central node in his own network? So how can the team work together to strengthen Joey's connections with the key people in his ecosystem of support? And it is very helpful to know who is the most connected person if you're going to start this work. Because if you can find out who the most connected person is, then that begins to help you create a roadmap for the best way to connect the young adult and make them more central in their own network. And this goal of connecting the young adult and creating the young adult as the central actor in their own network and helping them to understand how to build their own social capital ecosystem, I think it's a very powerful idea. I heard in the last presentation the word cradle to career, right? People saying that we need to start these things when the child is born. Right? I think in some ways this is the same sort of thing. Like, you have to start helping the young adult way before they're a young adult to understand what their networks are and what their opportunities are and how to build them and how to think about resources that they can access. So, this is something that ideally we would start earlier, but we can think about it now for those that are transitioning. All right, and I had a little thing that I wrote in there as I was listening to the presentation about how I know that all of you sitting in your seats are much more immersed in very complicated networks than this one that I'm presenting, and that you have, but what I'm trying to offer you is the hope that this kind of thing might be able to be measured systematically, and that hopefully that could relieve some of the burden and also create visibility for the rest of the team to understand how much work is involved in all of the efforts that people make to create these transitions. All right, so the next thing to talk about is the barriers, and I don't think I'm going to tell any of you anything new. This next series of slides, I know you guys are all really connected with these barriers, but I'm just going to mention them so that we can all, acknowledge them. So Paul Shattuck and his team at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute have done great work showing us the difficulties that young adults with autism face during transition. They discovered that 4 out of 10 youth with ASD were completely disconnected from work and continued education opportunities during the first 6 years after high school. Disconnection from employment represents a huge loss of social capital. Our places of employment provide us with many, many resources. For example, our workmates help us learn new skills. They provide companionship and friendship. Our workplaces provide healthcare insurance and local and regional resources through their connections in the communities that we live in. Shattuck's team also found out that many young adults were disconnected from services post-secondary. This service cliff that young adults experience post-secondary also represents a loss of social capital. K-12 schools have many connections to therapists, training programs, rehabilitation, vocational work, internships, career and development programs. And when young adults with autism transition out of schools, they lose all of those supports. It turns out that building connections among team members requires resources. It can be expensive to build connections. Someone has to make the time to find the opportunity to build the connection, and they have to put in the effort to establish the trust and figure out the coordination, and this represents a huge amount of work. In the field of social networks that business people manage, so businesses like to think about social capital for their workplaces, and they measure the cost of creating opportunities, just social relational opportunities, and it's high. So it involves time, and it involves sometimes a lot of money and resources to build connections that will yield social capital. So this is something that's very underestimated, and it does impact who ends up having social capital. So when you look at the distribution of social capital, it's very unequal, and it's quite aligned with income and other kinds of societal advantages. So we want to try and figure out how to break that, to close that gap and create alternative ways to build social capital that hopefully that don't require the time and the costs that are currently required to build them. All right, so trust. I'm sure you all know that trust is a magic ingredient that makes social capital flow through networks. It is very difficult to create, and especially in challenging situations like transition. When things are hard at home, trust can break down. It can be difficult to build trust among people from different contexts. For example, trust between home and school, or trust between school and healthcare providers. This all takes work, and teams have to learn how to build relationships with each other when they might all have different goals and perspectives about what needs to be done. And of course, what happens as a result is a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blame. So blame is common in environments where outcomes are hard to define. So when you have a very difficult outcome to define, finger pointing ensues because someone's not getting the outcome that you want, they're not producing it, but they are targeting a different outcome, and this lack of alignment can create a lot of tension on these teams. It helps when a team has a clear goal and a target outcome. All right, and then each of these contexts, homeschool and clinical, they all have their own burdens. At home, you have challenges just from everyday living and events that happen, a death in the family, or different kinds of things that place burden on the family that make things like helping and planning for transition even more difficult. And then organizations also have a lot of their own burdens that they try to work through and that have to do with legal restraints or financial constraints or mandates that are not aligning. It was heartening to listen to the agencies talk up here about how much that they are trying to change the culture of California. That's not an easy thing to do. That's a very impressive effort. But there's a lot of burden involved in doing something like that. All right, and then it's also difficult when your outcomes are unclear and when your situations are so unique. It's very hard to find the right information that you need to solve the problem at hand. And so networks can help with this. Sometimes you can find, by going onto Facebook or some other place, you can find just that magical piece of information that you needed to connect you to the next thing that gave you your solution. But this is all hard work, and it's very hard to coordinate. So those are all some of the challenges that come to mind when you think about building a team that can do this work. But now I get to share with you 2 social capital ecosystem maps from this study that we did at Drexel, and where we pilot tested it. So with 15 young adults, we asked them who were their key supporters and what resources did they provide for you and how connected are your key supporters to each other. So we have our first young adult, and he identified 4 people that were key supporters: mom, dad, a friend, and a therapist. And he reported that mom has financial supports, dad provides financial supports, the therapist provides emotional support and advice, and the friend provides emotional support. So what we see some interesting features here just looking at this simple network. We see that mom and dad are not connected. So this is an important feature of this young adults network, that mom and dad are not connected. And so really when you think of the team, I mean, this could be a structural feature. Mom and dad perhaps are divorced, they live in separate places, and they're not talking. So the young adult their team has that feature in it. So sometimes these social network maps can show the team where, not just where communication could happen, but where communication is likely not to happen too, and for very particular and specific reasons. So what we see here is the therapist and the friend connected, which is it's an interesting connection that you have here. And what we learned from this young adult is that the therapist had sponsored a group, and then they made this friend at that group. So the connection there started with the therapist, where the therapist was, through that intervention, able to add another member to this young adult's network, which is a friendship member to this young adult's network, which is, I would think, a good outcome of that social group. All right, so our second young adult identified the uncle, the grandfather, the grandmother, and mom. And here we see a very, very tightly connected intergenerational home network. And a lot of resources. Everyone is providing a lot of support for this young adult: financial, emotional advice, and logistic, and job support, and friendship. So what you find here in this network is it's a very strong home network with a lot. And one of our major findings from across this small sample of 15 networks was this was one of the only maps that actually listed any kind of job support. And in this instance, it was coming from family. So there was only 2 young adults that mentioned employment or job supports at all. And this was one of them. So one thing you could think about with this map is, yes, wonderful home intergenerational connections and a lot of resources coming from home, but the opportunity here is to figure out where in the community or what other kinds of organizations or resources could we connect this young adult to create a little bit more diversity. And then they would be able to reach perhaps resources that they can't reach through their home network. So while the resources here are rich and I'm sure very important to this young adult, if you broker to other contexts, you gain access to new kinds of resources that you can't gain from your home network. So that's another way to think about this network. All right, so now I'm going to talk about 4 different strategies for building social capital ecosystems for young adults with autism. And these are very network-specific kind of things. These are ways that we would use social network analysis to measure things. So some of the names of these things sound strange and weird, but it's just the network name for this kind of move that you would make. So for example, you can change individuals. You can change individuals, change groups, you can do induction strategies and alteration strategies. So let's start with changing individuals. So there is a very common intervention now in public health called, it's to create champions. They're really interested in this in public health. When they want to get they want to get doctors to do a new kind of procedure, they create a champion at the hospital to start championing this new procedure, and they try to get all the doctors to do the new procedure, and they have the one champion in there rooting for everybody to try and get the doctor to do something different. This is the same kind of intuition where you sort of figure out who's the champion on the team. Now, and then you give resources to that person, right? So you not only do you create a champion, but you resource the champion. so that that person then has some of the tools they need to build the network. The next strategy is called segmentation, and this is the idea that when you have a team, you can't just change one or two people on the team. Sometimes you have to change everybody so that everybody's aligned around the same goals, right? So if you don't align the team together, then you are not going to get the kind of outcomes that you might. Interventions target the entire team together, and they change the team, all the members of the team together. And there might only be certain things that the whole team needs to change, but this is the network intervention that you could use to change the whole team. The next one is an induction strategy, and this is sort of word of mouth idea. And the word of mouth idea is more like when there's a buzz about something, people get very excited and engaged. And if you can up people's enthusiasm for things, it can help. It can help a team accomplish their goals. So this idea of word of mouth and just encouraging people through creating buzz about certain ideas, it seems strange to me. Like, you know, they use it a lot in advertising or things like that. This is their main strategy. They do these commercials and they try to create a sense of something using this sort of what they call induction strategies, but I think you could do it on a team as well. And the last one is the hardest one, which is mostly what I've been spending my time talking with you about, which is the alteration, which is where are the gaps? Where are the missing links? Where are the missing people? Can we identify how to configure this network more effectively for success so that the young adult has more of the resources they need to transition successfully? And can we alter these networks? And that is the hardest intervention to do. It's the cutting edge of network science right now is to figure out, can we change networks on purpose? We all feel like we change our networks all the time in our everyday lives, like, oh, I made a new friend or I did this thing, but to do it systematically and on purpose is much harder than for something to just kind of happen. So this ends up being a lot more harder than you might imagine. All right, well, that is what I have to share with you today.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.